They already have a date, they already know the day, and if nothing changes, they also know how they will die. Each year, the judicial system of the United States, with its relentless machinery, schedules the execution of people who were sentenced to death decades ago. It is not a quick or arbitrary process. It is the final chapter of extensive litigation. Some of these individuals have spent 20, 30, even more than 40 years locked up in maximum security prisons, living under the constant shadow of the gallows or the lethal injection, waiting for the final court order to be fulfilled. It is a suspended existence, a life in perpetual limbo, where each sunrise is a reminder that time is running out. But who really are these men? Are they faceless monsters or complex individuals, shaped by circumstances and decisions? What did they do to be on that final list, to deserve the death penalty in the eyes of the state? And, perhaps more importantly, what does their story tell us about the justice system that condemned them, about its effectiveness, its flaws, and its own humanity? Their cases are not mere files. They are studies of the depths of human evil and the, at times, imperfect pursuit of justice. Today we'll tell you the most notorious cases of criminals with scheduled executions for this 2025. These are not rumors, nor speculations born from sensationalist media. These dates are signed by judges. They are official and irrevocable decisions marking the end of a long wait. Their stories force us to confront the brutality of their crimes, the complexity of their defenses, and the ethical implications of a state that exercises supreme power over the lives of its citizens. Some of them continue to insist on their innocence. Others confessed, but their lives hide more than their sentences reveal. Let's begin. A .22 caliber pistol, a wood engraving tool, and a fury so personal that the scene looked more like a message than a crime. A brutal statement chiseled with violence. These were not random tools. They were extensions of a deep, almost intimate rage that erupted in the stillness of an autumn night. Each bullet, each wound, each blow not only took lives, but engraved a story of horror and an unsettling question about the nature of human hatred. On the night of October 1st, 1989, in a house that was once a haven of peace in Nashville, Tennessee, that horror materialized. 3 lives were extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. Judith Smith, Oscar's wife, and her 2 teenage sons, Jason and Chad Burnett, were found lifeless. A tragic triptych of devastation. Their bodies, marked by multiple gunshot wounds, stab wounds, and blunt force trauma, told a chilling story of an attack that did not simply aim to kill, but to annihilate, leaving a trail of violence that would resonate for decades in the annals of American criminology. The brutality of the act defied logic, pointing to a mind consumed by an incomprehensible rage, unleashed against those who should have been safe in their own home. Oscar Franklin Smith, the father and stepfather of the victims, was arrested days after the massacre. Authorities presented a seemingly solid case against him, alleging he had left traces of blood and fingerprints at the crime scene that directly linked him to the horrific act. Moreover, they argued that Smith had a strong motive, a bitter and prolonged custody battle over the children, coupled with intense financial tensions with Judith. The combination of these factors appeared to seal his guilt. However, Oscar Franklin Smith's case was never entirely clean. From the beginning, it was plagued with controversies and doubts that set it apart from many other files. For years, Smith claimed his innocence with unwavering insistence. His lawyers fought hard, arguing that the forensic evidence was weak and circumstantial, and more seriously, that the police had contaminated the crime scene, compromising the integrity of the collected evidence. These allegations cast a shadow of doubt over the validity of the process. In 2022, the clock of justice almost stopped for Smith when his execution was scheduled. But in a dramatic twist, it was suspended at the last minute due to errors in the lethal injection. Most shocking was that the state of Tennessee publicly admitted that it had not followed its own protocols to carry out the execution, a failure that not only saved Smith's life in that moment, but also exposed flaws within the system that had condemned him. This procedural error reopened the debate on the reliability of capital punishment in Smith's case, keeping alive the question about his true guilt. In April 2023, Governor Bill Lee ordered a pause on all executions in Tennessee to thoroughly review the system, a decision that offered a brief respite and hope for those on death row. However, in 2025, Oscar Franklin Smith, despite the persistent doubts about his guilt, and the procedural errors in his case returned to the execution list. Today, at 73 years old, Oscar Franklin Smith is one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Tennessee, a figure symbolizing the prolonged and often tortuous legal battle. His execution has been rescheduled for December, and this time, sadly, everything indicates that the sentence will finally be carried out, closing a chapter of decades of appeals, controversies, and a quest for justice that, for many, remains incomplete. Excerpt from a fictional criminologist, Dr. Alan Mercado. What stands out most in this crime is not the act itself, but the mixture of methods. A profiler might suggest that the killer wanted to punish, not just kill. That speaks of accumulated anger, of an emotional bond with the victims. And that kind of crime almost always points inward, to the family. The case of Oscar Franklin Smith is, in many ways, a mirror of the system. Old, complex, full of shadows and delays. But not all the names on this list come from the distant past. Some crimes are more recent and colder. Mikal Mahdi set a forest on fire, but what came afterward was even darker. A chilling story of premeditated violence unfolded in the year 2000, when an act of intentional vandalism escalated into a brutal murder. Mahdi started a wildfire in Alabama, not as a mere act of recklessness, but as a deadly trap. The fire, devouring the vegetation, attracted the brave who risked their lives to protect the community. When a volunteer firefighter named Melissa Garrett arrived at the scene to extinguish the flames, driven by her commitment to others, Mahdi ambushed her. This was not a random encounter. It was a calculated and merciless act. He dragged her to a secluded area, a place where the darkness and chaos of the fire could conceal the evil of his actions. And there, he brutally murdered her. At that moment, the motive behind such extreme and cold violence was unclear, leaving investigators and the community in a state of shock and confusion. However, the truth would emerge in a moment of raw revelation. During his trial, Mahdi, faced with the consequences of his actions, confessed to the horrific crime. The reason behind his brutality was not a sudden burst of rage, but a cold criminal logic. He had killed Garrett because she had identified him during a previous robbery. He didn't want to leave loose ends, didn't want any witnesses that could tie him to his past crimes. Melissa Garrett's life was mercilessly sacrificed to protect a criminal's impunity, revealing the alarming extent of human depravity. The crime was classified as one of the cruelest of the decade by local media. Mahdi was sentenced to death in 2006. For years, he filed motions and appeals, but all were denied. In 2025, Alabama confirmed his execution by means of nitrogen hypoxia, a new method recently approved in that state. He will be the second man in modern history to be executed by that procedure. The Mahdi case reveals a pattern of operational coldness. Setting a fire to lure a victim shows premeditation, but the goal wasn't to steal, it was to silence. That type of behavior fits a narcissistic predator profile. If Mahdi's crime was an act of calculation, what follows is the opposite: emotional, impulsive, and deeply intimate brutality. When the victim is a child, the public response ceases to be legal. It becomes visceral. This case is particularly sensitive, one that resonated with deep outrage and sadness across the country. Jeffrey Hutchinson was convicted of the heinous crime of kidnapping, abusing, and murdering an 11-year-old girl in 1993. The event, which shocked the nation, took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, leaving an open wound in the community and in the collective conscience. According to court records, Hutchinson kidnapped the minor from a place that should have been safe, a shopping mall. This act of cold and calculated violence triggered a desperate search. Tragically, her body was found 3 days later in a wooded area, a desolate place that became the final stage of her short life. The autopsy not only confirmed her death but revealed heartbreaking details. The girl had been a victim of abuse and strangulation, revealing the unimaginable brutality of the crime committed by Hutchinson. The cruelty of this case left an indelible mark, reminding us of the vulnerability of the innocent and the unyielding need for justice. During the trial, the jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty. More than 30 years later, his execution has been scheduled. Hutchinson has attempted to appeal, alleging mental and dissociative disorders, but so far, the courts have denied his petitions. There are crimes that not only mark the victims, but the entire system that investigates them. The Hutchinson case was one of them. It accelerated reforms in missing child search protocols, and it left an unerasable scar in Oklahoma. While Hutchinson represents the darkest extreme of individual crime, there are cases in which the threat was broader. People who killed not just once, but multiple times. Faces that crossed state lines, leaving a trail of death. And among them all, one stands out for his charismatic coldness. He called himself the Casanova Killer. But the police had another name for him: traveling serial killer. Glenn Rogers is not just any name in the criminal world. It is synonymous with terror and an itinerant brutality that left a trail of death in his wake. In the 1990s, his crimes spread across at least 5 states: California, Florida, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Louisiana, painting a map of horror across the southern United States. Rogers was a charismatic drifter, a deceptively charming figure who used his charm to get close to his victims. He met them in everyday places like bars, gas stations, and traveling fairs, weaving a web of trust before revealing his true nature. Once the connection was established, he would take them to secluded, desolate places with no witnesses, where he would murder them brutally. Most of his victims were women. His reign of terror came to an end in November 1995. After an interstate chase that captured public attention, Rogers was finally arrested. He was convicted for the murder of Linda Price, his last known victim in Florida, a case that sealed his fate. Since then, he has been on death row in that state, accumulating convictions for serial homicides that have solidified him as one of the most prolific and ruthless killers of his time. His story is a grim reminder of how appearances can deceive and how violence can lurk in the most unexpected places. Although some media outlets have tried to link him with more famous cases, he was even connected to the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, which was dismissed by the FBI itself. The truth is that his real crimes were already terrifying enough. In 2025, after nearly 3 decades of appeals and denials, his execution has been set. At 62 years old, Rogers is still considered one of the most notorious killers on death row. The pattern of Rogers, walk, seduce, kill, is a classic among itinerant predators. His psychological profile shows extreme antisocial traits, but also a high capacity for emotional manipulation. He didn't kill on impulse, he killed to feel superior. Fictional report by criminologist Dr. Hernan Salvatierra. Rogers was a predator who knew no geographic boundaries, but not all the condemned were serial killers. Some committed only one crime, a single act, that destroyed everything. And when that crime happens within the family, the word horror takes on a whole new meaning. He killed her. He buried her in her own backyard, and then he lived in her house as if nothing had happened. The case of Tracy Beatty is a chilling tale of filial violence and deception. Beatty was convicted of the brutal murder of his own mother, Carolyn Click, in November 2003 in Smith County, Texas. The prosecution detailed a disturbing crime. Beatty, who already had a history of abuse and violent behavior, had an argument with his mother. What followed was an act of unimaginable horror. He strangled her and then, with calculated coldness, buried her body in the backyard of the house, the very place that should have been a refuge. Beatty's cold-blooded nature manifested in the weeks following the crime. Far from showing remorse, he continued using his mother's bank account and car. To maintain the charade, he told neighbors that Carolyn had gone on a trip, weaving a web of lies to conceal his atrocious act. The case deeply shocked the state of Texas due to the eerie coldness with which Beatty handled the entire situation. During the trial, multiple witnesses testified, revealing years of tension and a history of violence between mother and son, including recurring episodes of verbal and physical abuse, painting a dark picture of a relationship marked by aggression that culminated in a ruthless matricide. Tracy Beatty was sentenced to death in 2004 for the horrific murder of his mother. In 2022, his execution was temporarily suspended for a medical review, a legal loophole his lawyers pursued on the grounds that Beatty showed signs of untreated psychosis. This motion sparked a debate about mental health and capital punishment. However, in a recent turn of events, in this very year 2025, the new execution date has been officially confirmed, thus closing a judicial chapter that has dragged on for over 2 decades. Few deaths challenge our understanding of familial love as much as a matricide, the act of taking the life of one's own mother. It is a crime that subverts the most fundamental bonds of human existence. those of nurture and affection. It forces us to confront a harrowing question. What has to break inside a person to cross that line? Is it the culmination of deep-seated resentment, an undiagnosed mental illness, or a lethal combination of factors that destroy any trace of filial compassion? A son's ability to commit such a heinous act confronts us with the fragility of the human psyche and the dark abysses that can, at times, open even within the most sacred relationships. While there is no conclusive evidence of schizophrenia, Beatty's file does reveal elements of paranoia and impulsiveness. It's possible that there were undiagnosed delusional episodes, but that doesn't justify it. It only contextualizes it. Fictional analysis, Dr. Nuria Gutierrez, forensic psychiatrist. And even so, behind all the violence, there are stories that begin with abandonment, with silence, with unattended traumas. There are inmates who never had a real chance to redeem themselves because they were never allowed to learn how to live. Jimmy Dean Ham is one of them. In 1987, Jimmy Dean Ham broke into a convenience store in Dothan, Alabama. During the robbery, the owner, a 63-year-old man named Patrick Cunningham, was shot in the head and killed. Ham was captured shortly after the crime and quickly confessed to his actions. However, what significantly complicated the case was his age. He was only 20 years old at the time of the murder. Added to this was an extensive and tragic history of childhood abuse, institutional neglect, and untreated mental disorders. These factors painted a complex picture of a young man whose life had been marked by adversity from an early age, raising serious questions about his moral culpability and mental capacity. Despite the multiple appeals presented by his defense, precisely based on his cognitive capacity and the impact of his traumatic childhood, the court upheld the conviction. Ultimately, his execution was scheduled. This case has resonated deeply in debates about the death penalty, being used as a powerful example of the inherent complexities in executing individuals with severe childhood trauma and borderline mental conditions. The discussion centers on whether a justice system can execute people whose full responsibility is questioned due to a history of suffering and compromised mental health. The crime was clear. So was the confession. But Jimmy Dean Ham's story doesn't begin with that gunshot. It begins decades earlier, in a home where punishment was the norm and food a rare privilege. Each of these men committed an atrocious crime. Some admitted to it, others deny it. But they all share something. The calendar already has their date marked. And that date is not a threat. It is a sentence. One that doesn't await redemption nor remorse. Only fulfillment. Oscar Franklin Smith, Michael Mahdi, Glenn Rogers, Tracy Beatty, Jimmy Dean Ham, Jeffrey Hutchinson. Names that could very soon cease to exist in the living records of the U.S. prison system. The crimes these men committed were, without a doubt, heinous, leaving behind a trail of pain and devastation. Their victims and the suffering they endured must never be forgotten. But behind every death sentence, every trial, and every life condemned to end, there is a much broader and more complex story. It is a narrative that intertwines the decisions made by prosecutors, the possible failures of the defense, the forensic errors that can unjustly tip the scales, the broken childhoods that brand a person's fate, and a legal system that, although built with the pretense of being infallible, inevitably carries its own shadows and deficiencies. In some of these cases, like that of Tracy Beatty, severe mental conditions have been dismissed or underestimated by the judicial system, despite clinical warnings and professional diagnoses. This raises a fundamental question about justice and responsibility when an accused's mind is compromised. In others, like the infamous Glenn Rogers, the public fame of their crimes and the sensationalist headlines that surrounded him for years completely overshadowed the more human and profound questions. Could a person like him be rehabilitated? Did he ever show an ounce of remorse for the carnage he left behind? And perhaps the most unsettling question: why did he keep killing with no apparent motive beyond compulsion? These questions force us to look beyond the conviction and to question the system's ability to address the complexity of the criminal mind and the underlying failures in society that could, in part, contribute to such tragedies. And then there's time. Most of these men have spent more than 2 decades awaiting their death. Some, more than 30 years. That is not swift justice. It is not immediate punishment. It is a limbo designed by bureaucracy and upheld by politics. Many of these inmates have changed, some physically, others mentally. But the law, in its binary logic, does not consider the passage of time as a form of transformation. To justice, a sentence is a straight line, not a cycle. States like Texas, Alabama, and Florida continue to defend capital punishment as a legitimate tool. But each execution reignites the same debate: are we truly applying justice or vengeance? And while the system responds with protocols, dates, and chemical substances, the families, both of the victims and the condemned, live through a grief that never ends. Each name on this list is a story that ends with an exact date. But between the sentence and the execution, there is life. There is memory. There is a system still asking itself whether the harshest justice is also the most just. And you, who watched this video until the end, what do you think? Does execution close the cycle, or does it only make it irreversible?